Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for August 23rd, 2021. On Saturday, the Schiller Institute had another conference, this one on what just happened in Afghanistan, a pathway ahead. And instead of lamenting the collapse of the government that was installed by the United States and NATO, which really was a mistake to begin with, instead of lamenting that, we presented a perspective on how to use this as an opportunity to end the danger of nuclear war, of geopolitical confrontation, and to remove the United States from the British leash, which is what put us into these endless wars. We proposed that, first of all, toss out the endless war paradigm. This has been a theme of Helga Zepp-LaRouche for many years, and it goes back to what Lyndon LaRouche said when we first went into Afghanistan. We are not there to impose American-style governments because it doesn't work. But the idea of a military solution in a place like Afghanistan has been wrong. So toss out that paradigm, including the regime change policy. Secondly, talk to the new government in the making. Don't assume we know what they're going to do. It was 20 years since the last government was thrown out, the last Taliban government. Create an environment in which there's an opportunity for them to live up to the promises they made at a press conference last week and actually begin a process of reconciliation within Afghanistan. And in order to do that, 3, get the economic projects going. And that was the proposal that came from Mrs. LaRouche. It was discussed and chewed over by a number of people who were looking at some of the alternatives, some of the problems, people with experience in Afghanistan, and the dialogue as a whole is extremely useful for looking at what needs to be done now. Instead of finger pointing, it's how do we get out of this situation? Now, on the finger pointing, look, the latest is Tony Blair, and this is unconscionable. The man who got us into these endless wars, Tony Blair, who more than anybody, perhaps besides Dick Cheney, Wolfowitz, and others, got us into these endless wars, Blair came out and attacked Biden. Let me read you some quotes from him. This was in the Sunday Times, but it was put out on Blair's website, which is a website for I think it's Institute for Global Affairs or Global Peace. The Sunday Times headline was Blair attacks Biden's, quote, imbecilic, unquote, retreat. Now, he's not criticizing the way Biden and his team got us out, where I think there is a legitimate concern that we should have done something to make sure the American civilians and the Afghans who worked with us got out first before we withdrew the military. That's a legitimate concern. What he's saying is we shouldn't have left the war. What Blair said is that the idea of ending forever wars is imbecilic. And he goes on to say that we didn't need to do it. We chose to do it. We did it in obedience to an imbecilic political slogan about ending the forever wars. And he said, not consulting the British, and this is what someone else said in this article, not consulting the British poses the risk that, Blair said it, that Britain would be relegated to the second division of global powers. Now, Blair then goes on to ask the question, has the West lost its strategic will? And he says the decision to leave was not driven by grand strategy, but by politics. He goes on to attack Putin, and he ends up saying, if the West wants to shape the 21st century, it will take commitment. Now, what does he mean by this? He comes out in the discussion, the longer paper, talking about geopolitics. The British have a long-term commitment to use Afghanistan as a pivot, as a wedge, for destabilizing Eurasian nations, destabilizing South Asian nations, destabilizing Russia, and so on. That's what the British commitment is, and it goes back to the great game of the 1830s and 1840s. So Blair is not talking about what we did and the way that we pulled out. He's saying we should have stayed in there because we have to be in there. It's British American interests, and by American interests he means America functioning on a British leash. Now, Besides Blair, there was one other person who stuck out to me who was attacking Biden over the weekend, and it was none other than Liz Cheney, an anti-Trump Republican congresswoman whose father was mainly responsible or largely responsible for the U.S. getting into these wars in the first place. And what she said is that the reason it's wrong what we did is that we're now being attacked by in the British Parliament and by NATO members, and that we shouldn't have listened to the popular opinion. Leaders have to lead, we should have stayed. Now, Liz Cheney and Tony Blair are not friends of Donald Trump. Why would Trump jump in a large sense to defend the arguments being made by Cheney and Blair? Donald Trump was absolutely right when he said we have to end these never-ending wars. Blair said that's an imbecilic concept, that there are endless wars. And so remember, Blair played a leading role in getting us into these wars with the dossier from MI6, which said that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction. Remember also, the same MI6 produced the Christopher Steele, who drafted the dossier, which was at the heart of the getting rid of Trump. And that Tony Blair, who's a member of the Privy Council, sits side by side with members of the House of Lords, who put out a report in 2018 saying that Trump must not have a second term or it will damage or destroy the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. So Blair is no friend of Donald Trump. He's no friend of the United States. In fact, much of this concept of never-ending wars goes back to Blair's speech in 1999 at the Chicago Council of World Affairs, when he argued that the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, had to be overturned. Now, what was it in the Peace of Westphalia that he didn't like? Well, it's that there must be no intervention in other nations' affairs, and we should treat other nations with respect and treat them as we would wish to be treated. In a sense, a national sovereign concept of the Golden Rule. Blair said that's no longer acceptable because there are evil actors, and we have to have instead the responsibility to protect, to justify intervention, to overthrow governments, even elected governments, that don't go along with the policies of the British Empire. So Blair is enunciating clearly a doctrine on behalf of the City of London finances and its alliance with Wall Street. And it's that alliance which underlies the so-called military-industrial complex, which is committed to these never-ending wars for the benefit of its assertion of global strategic supremacy. So siding with Blair, siding with those who are saying that it was a mistake to get out of the war, is siding with the enemies of a sovereign United States. And instead of calling for Biden to resign, as President Trump has, perhaps he should go back to what he said earlier, get out of these wars, and instead get out of the global casino economy, which is undermining the United States at a point in which we need to be investing in rebuilding our productive economy. So I think this is proof of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche is saying, that this is an opportunity to reverse the errors of U.S. policy that go back to 1971, go back 50 years to the shift away from a productive American system economy into a casino economy where speculation and globalization and so-called market economies, which basically there's no such thing as a market economy. It's controlled by the largest financial interests in the world. And these are the enemies of American sovereignty. They're the ones who want us in these wars so that no one will question the economic policies which are turning us into a deindustrialized rubbish heap. So I would urge people who are supporters of President Trump to rethink this knee-jerk reaction in Afghanistan. Was it done wrong? Should we correct it? Should we make sure that we're there until we can get all the Americans and American allies out? Yes, we should. But we should at the same time be engaged in a process of opening economic development talks for the people who are going to remain, because we can't evacuate 30 million people from Afghanistan. We have to make sure that that country has an economic future. And that's what was discussed at the conference this last weekend on August 21st. And I'd urge you to watch that to get a sense of real politics, real diplomacy in action, as opposed to the cheap partisan blame game that's characterizing the reaction to what happened in Afghanistan. So thank you for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow.